finish it on Monday, and your chapter 2 homework is what is due on Sunday night. So please don't forget that. Today we're going to dig a little deeper into that economic decision maker category that we talked about. Can't remember if it was chapter 1 or chapter 2. Probably chapter 1. We talked about those two different tiers, if you will, of economic decision makers. And we talked about the top tier being households and the second tier being firms, government, and the rest of the world. And so this chapter really takes each of those tiers and each of those categories and just breaks them down a little bit more, talks about the specifics of those decision makers and their role that they play in our economy, and just gives you a little bit more detail. A lot of this is stuff you already know, but it's just making you think about it more in economic terms, maybe instead of historical terms or things like that. So we have to start out by talking about households. Households, we already determined, wasn't necessarily a traditional household of 2 parents and 2 kids or whatever. It can be a multi-generational household. It could be just people who are unrelated living underneath one roof, but it's people typically living under one roof making economic decisions together, whatever that looks like. And we know that in our particular economy, these people are the drivers. These groups of people are the drivers in that they demand the goods and services. There is no reason for a producer in the US economy to produce anything unless the people demand it, unless the households want it and are willing to buy it. We just have way too many choices of goods and services that we're not going to buy something we don't want because it's the only thing on the market, because we just have so much on the market available to us. So we decide on a whim that we want to demand something or stop demanding something, as the case may be. So there's no reason for stuff to get produced that we don't want. So that's really one of the biggest economic drivers in the US economy, is that demand for goods and services. The other thing we do is we supply resources. Primarily households supply the labor resource. And we use that labor resource in our economy to produce goods and services. Firms and the government buy labor to produce goods and services. We might, as a household, have some of those other private resources for sale. So we might have some natural resources. We might have some entrepreneurial ability, or we might actually have some capital. And we can sell those to generate income. That's why households sell their resources, is to generate income, to then turn around and meet the demand that we have. Households make economic choices, big economic choices, and really every single day we make economic choices, big ones for our economy. The first one, we know, we just talked about it, is what to purchase. What are we going to demand? Therefore, what are producers going to produce for us? The second really big decision that we make as a household is how much money to save. What kind of impact do you think saved money has on our economy? Is it a good thing? Is it a good thing for households to save money? Any thoughts? Is it a good thing for households to save money? Yes? Okay.
For them, not for us, for the economy.
Okay. Yeah, that actually is the more complete answer, right? Yes, it is good for a household to have saved money. We hear this over and over and over again. Here in the US, we do a bad job saving money as households. We save literally just a couple % of our income at best. Is that good? Yeah, because we have money to cover emergencies. It's not good for the economy. Good for households to save. Saving is not good for an economy. Money that gets spent and cycled through an economy is really what keeps it healthy. You will never, and this is across political party lines here. You will never hear a politician get on a State of the Union address or get on any sort of platform and say, American people, you need to save more money. Those words have never been spoken. Why? Because it's not good for an economy. And somewhere along the lines, we started giving presidents, governors, we started giving them credit for the way the economy is operating. And it's a huge thing for them in terms of reelection or whatever. How is the economy doing? Literally had nothing to do with the decisions made by a single solitary human being. It's a collection of decisions made by households all over the country that really determines how the economy is doing, right? And so the more we spend, the better the economy is, because money that gets cycled through the economy creates more and more demand. It multiplies, if you will. So if I spend 20 bucks on something, it then becomes income for somebody else, who then takes it and spends it on something they want. That becomes income for somebody else who takes it and spends it, and that just keeps going. And think of all the demand for goods and services that can be generated by my $20 being injected into the economy, right? It's got this multiplier effect, spending does. And so if anything, you hear politicians get up and say, the economy's great, everything's fine, don't worry about it. Go out, have fun, travel, spend your money, buy the things you want, everything's great. Interest rates are low, go and buy. Because you're actually the one. Households actually determine, in many cases, now I know in this case we have a pandemic, and well, households do have some control over their decision making, right? There's some decisions that are being made for us, but for the most part, it is these households, these individual households, and the decision they make on whether to save or spend money have huge economic impacts. And so listen closely. If you ever listen to the State of the Union address or something like that, State of the Union address always says the economy's looking, it doesn't matter who the president is, it doesn't matter. The economy's looking great, get out there, do your thing, spend your money, it's gonna be fine, right? Because it's the only way it's gonna be fine is if you actually get out there and spend your money. Where to live, again, big economic decision that households have to make. Where you live determines your job. It determines your standard of living, how much you can have, what size house you can have, what kind of goods and services are available to you, your quality of life. So it's not just monetary, right? Your quality of life is determined by the place that you live. That's a big choice that households make. Whether they buy or rent, whether they live in a city or in the country, whether they live in a place where they have income, like state income tax or not. There's lots of different considerations. Living in Flagstaff, for those of you that are here in Flag, that's a big decision, right? It's pretty expensive compared to most places. I've lived here for 30 plus years, and every year I live here, right, that's an expensive decision that I make for quality of life over standard of living, right? Because we could all have more someplace else, probably. Well, California is probably the exception, right? And where to work. Where to work, this where to live, where to work thing, they usually go hand in hand together, but we usually, again, congregate towards cities for employment. This started happening a long time ago, where we started centralizing production, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. And people started congregating, in cities together where a lot of that production was happening. But all big economic choices that you have to make as households that really are primary drivers in our economy. What to purchase and how much to save, those are huge, huge decisions. And we'll talk more about that. So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of the household. Households haven't always looked this way. They started out very different than where they have ended up. And households in the beginning, and this happens for, I mean, I can say this for most societies, is that when areas were first settled, if you will, households were almost entirely self-sufficient, especially in rural areas. When the West was settled, the Western United States were settled, you know, we had a lot of homesteads and ranches and farms that were essentially self-sufficient, which meant you had to grow the food you were going to eat. You probably built your own home, you raised your own animals, your own garden. You did a lot of your own production, just simply because it wasn't available to you. There weren't other people producing other things that you could trade or whatever. Now, if we talk about communities, Native American communities, tribes in other countries, African tribes, things like that, we're talking about slightly different types of communities in which they stay together more often than they venture off and try and, like the Europeans, settle new lands. But here in the US, we really started out with these farm households that were entirely self-sufficient. The first time we saw organized production was with something we call the cottage industry. And this is actually something that's coming back because we're kind of getting tired. Some people are getting tired of mass-produced goods and want to go back to maybe purchasing goods that are more unique, more handcrafted, more special, if you will. But the cottage industry really grew out of entrepreneurs wanting to take what's called excess capacity in households. Excess capacity means these households could be producing more, right? But if you're a farm or a homestead or something like that, and you produce extra of something, there wasn't a really good way for you to get those extra goods to market. And so the cottage industry was basically a group of entrepreneurs who would go around asking households, like farmers markets, exactly, Shelby, something like this, right? Collecting, perhaps talking households into producing excess goods that then they would come around and collect, pay the household for these excess goods, and then take them to some larger market where there was demand and they could be sold. And many times, these entrepreneurs would take raw materials to these farms. Let's say, for instance, somebody was good at building furniture, but needed more lumber. Someone would take lumber to these households would produce furniture, then someone would come back and collect these goods, take them to a large market where there was demand and where these goods could be sold. Okay, so it was the first organized production that we saw. And then we take it one step further, right? And we look at something like factories, which is really ultimate in organized production, organized labor. But really this happened when people started congregating in more urban areas, into cities, when people started moving into cities, that we were really able to see increased specialization, people going to a job, 40, 50, 60, however many hours a week, and earning their income that way. But then it created a situation where we really became more dependent on other people. Because if you're doing something, one thing, specializing in the same thing for hours a day, it's something you can't then do for yourself. That's time you don't have to do stuff for yourself. So it became a trade-off, and it was really a snowball effect. The more people that moved into cities looking for jobs, the more people ended up specializing, and the more dependent we became on other people. And that was really where we've ended up today. I mean, I am really solely dependent on other people for almost everything, right? Because I've specialized, and then I take my paycheck and I go to Target and I buy stuff from other people who have specialized, or firms or countries who have specialized, right? And the other thing with factories and coordinated organized production is you can introduce technology fairly easily in these types of environments to then exponentially increase productivity. So yeah, factories are what created the situation we live in today where we can just consume, but it's also created this dependence on one another. If the farmers stopped growing food, or if something happened, right, I don't have any food crop. I am totally dependent. And so it's created a situation, right, where we've all become, very intertwined with one another. Households do depend on other households to supply labor to industries and produce those things that we need, right? Another big thing that happened to the households in terms of evolution is going to be the introduction of women to the workforce. So you can see the numbers I have there. 1950, about 15% of women were in the workforce in 1950. And then you can see that today it's 70%. It's actually higher than that. That's the most recent number that your author has in the book, but it's closer to 75% today. What happened that pushed women into the workforce? From history class. Thank you. World War II. Okay. A lot of men went off to war. That was a big war. And a lot of men left those factory jobs and went off to war. And these jobs were left empty. Well, I don't know if you know this about wars, but typically wars that are not fought on your own soil are great for your economy because they require a lot of production. You gotta make a lot of stuff to support a war. And especially if it's not happening on your soil and your capital isn't being destroyed in the process, it's just productivity. It's lots of productivity. And I'm not going to imply that the US joined the World War to get out of the Great Depression. Could be a coincidence. But what I can tell you is that there is always a spike in productivity during wars. And if you are in a depression or a recession, it can very quickly get you out. Yeah, it usually increases national debt and things like that too. We won't go into that, but it's good for productivity. It's good for an economy. So women started to enter the workforce to take these factory jobs, even if they didn't want the job to be patriotic, right? But it changed the way household looked in a pretty dramatic way. And this is the time period where we saw the introduction of things like, pre-made sort of meal kits, things like macaroni and cheese were introduced. Campbell's started to can soups. We started to see the introduction of, pre-packaged canned foods, TV dinners, things like that began to sort of emerge in their earliest forms during that time period because the households were becoming less and less self-sufficient. Households used to, in the 1950s, most households would provide their own childcare, would provide their own cooking and cleaning, right? That's household production. That's good stuff. That's as good of production as anything you can do in a factory. But households were doing it themselves, primarily as a woman's role in the household was to do a lot of that household production. So because women were leaving their households, that production now needed to be done by somebody else. So we saw childcare really change forms, right? Who's caring for children and how meal preparation was happening. So some interesting things were happening in the household. So we already talked about how households demand. You know that households are suppliers too. We've talked about it a couple times now, right? Why do we sell resources as households? To satisfy those wants that we have. We know they're unlimited, and especially now that we're not self-sufficient anymore, that's the primary use of our income, is to satisfy those other wants. Primarily, households have labor, which earns income, or you might have those other resources that can earn you some sort of income as well. But it's primarily labor in most households. Now let's talk about what happens to households with few resources. When we talked about pure capitalism, the end of the last chapter, we said that households with few or no resources under pure capitalism would likely perish. Because without the charity of others, the constant charity of others, households with no resources just aren't sustainable. But we don't live in a purely capitalist society. And so in our society, and in many, not all, households with few resources, for whatever reason, it actually doesn't matter, right, receive transfer payments. These are government payments. They are grants, which means they don't need to be repaid, but they are given to households who meet some threshold for resources. So this could be disabilities, this could be households with many children. Children don't have a labor resource yet, right? In this country, we don't allow children to sell labor until they're, of a certain age. I don't know if it's 14, 15, 16. I think it depends on the circumstance, right? But children don't have resources to sell. Elderly do not have resources to sell. And so these transfer payments are what allows these households to sustain. These transfer payments come in two different categories. The first one is going to be cash transfer payments. What is a cash transfer payment of the US government? There's probably a few big categories. This is a check that comes in the mail. Why would the US government send a check in the mail to one of these households? Social Security, Colby, that's our biggest one, right? By far the biggest one. What else? Disability is going to be another one. Hang on to that, Jake. Stimulus check. Stimulus check is a slightly different animal. It's not necessarily based on resources. But it is a cash transfer, but for a slightly different reason. Unemployment checks, thank you, an unemployment check. Like a welfare check, if you will. We really don't call it welfare anymore, but something like that. Those are going to be cash transfers. In-kind transfers are non-cash transfers. So a non-cash gift of the government that doesn't need to be given back. So Jake, that's going to be food stamps is going to be probably one of our best examples. What else? There are a couple more. In-kind transfers. Goods or services that are given away by the government to households with few resources.
EBT.
Yeah, so EBT, right, which kind of falls along that food stamp category, right? WIC checks, so women, infant, and children checks, definitely. Healthcare that's one of the big ones I'm looking for. So we not only like here in Arizona, I think it's called Access, and it's going to be for low-income households, healthcare for low-income households, but our retirees get it too, right, with Medicare. And so that's a huge expense. That's a huge in-kind transfer that the government gives away. We have subsidized housing. That's an in-kind transfer. We have a lot of early education programs for children who are at-risk households that maybe need a little bit of extra kind of head start on their education. This could be free lunches in the cafeteria at school. This is all of that stuff for households who essentially have to prove they are low resource households, right? Whether it's single parents or whatever, low income level, things like that, okay? They're called transfer payments because the government is transferring resources. They're transferring resources from households that have more of an ability to earn to households that have less of an ability to earn. And so that's why they're called a transfer. From an economic perspective, is they're collecting taxes from higher earning households, turning them around and distributing that to low earning households. Here's the thing from an economic perspective. From an economic perspective, there's absolutely no judgment about households that are high earners versus low earners. From an economic perspective, giving money to low resource households is a pretty good economic move, because what happens to every penny, usually every penny that's distributed to a low resource household?
It gets spent.
Spend it. Perfect, they spend it. That spending is a beautiful thing, and it stimulates an economy. And when low resource households take cash transfer payments and spend them back into the economy, that creates jobs for you and me and for other high earning or high resource households. So it creates jobs, if you will. So from an economic perspective, these cash transfers are a beautiful thing. One of my, and this might not be a popular thing for me to say, but when I look at stimulus checks from an economic perspective, I can't understand why some households got them. Because what we are learning is that households who didn't lose jobs are in the same exact financial situation they were before COVID or similar, are getting these stimulus checks and saving them. What's the point of a stimulus check if you don't stimulate the economy with it? Right? So it's a complicated thing, but stimulus checks to me are not all good across the board. They're not good until you spend them. And so we are pretty sure that these households are going to spend cash transfers. Though these are basically stimulus payments. They are stimulus payments that occur in our economy all the time. Stimulus payments given to households who don't need them are not stimulus payments. They're just increased national debt. Okay? Might not be a popular statement, but it's a true economic statement. Okay? All right, so let's break down our demands a little bit. We know we're demanders of goods and services. You know, that's the big role of households. We're going to divide our demand into 3 basic categories, just because they're very different categories of spending. The first one is going to be durable goods. That's something that we buy that lasts more than 3 years. What's a durable good? It's an example of a durable good.
Cars.
A washing
Cars.
machine.
Washing machines.
Couch.
TV. Go ahead.
A couch.
A couch. Good. Furniture, appliances, tools, technology, right? That's probably somewhere in that range. And then non-durable goods are going to be more of those consumables. So food, energy, gasoline, utilities, clothing, typically we only wear for 3 years. And then the third category is going to be services. Anytime you pay somebody to do something for you, whether it's because you don't have the time or because you don't have the skill, it's usually for one of those 2 reasons, okay? All right, so let's look at this pie chart really quick. When I bring up charts like this where there's just all sorts of data, it's not because I want you to memorize them, and it's not because I think you need to study them or have it available for an exam or anything like that. It's usually because I want to show you an overall picture of some data set, and I will always specifically tell you what I think is important, because not everything here is important. So this first pie chart, it sort of depicts where households get income from, and the second pie chart depicts how we spend our money. And there are just a couple interesting things here, right? And so first of all, and you probably all would have guessed this, is that wages and salaries from employment, from selling labor, is going to be the #1 way that households earn income. Okay, it's pretty obvious. Here it says 62%. These are 2014 numbers from your book, which was published in 2017. I don't know why your author wouldn't have updated that, but he didn't. So I'm just giving you the numbers in your book. They are a little old, but the proportions haven't changed that much. And then you can see where some of that other income comes from. Transfer payments, which we just talked about, is 10%. So 10% of households, right? Or 10% of household income. For some households, it's 100% of their income, but in total, 10% of household income comes from those transfer payments. The biggest category there is going to be Social Security by far. It's not even close. Social Security is our biggest transfer payment. Social Security is going to be a huge problem for your generation. Social Security was enacted at a time when life expectancies were in the 65 to 67 year range. Life expectancy has increased by 20, 25, 30 years since then. It was a system that was never intended to support 30 years of retirement. And we now have this sort of pyramid scheme thing that's been created where you're going to make payments to pay my Social Security, but what your generation is going to give me is probably more than I ever contributed. And so at some point that has to be rectified. The reason this hasn't been rectified, any guesses? Why have we not dealt with the Social Security problem? We know it's a problem. The government, every government official knows it's a problem. Why haven't we dealt with this?
Could it
We
be
don't want to. What else?
representation in politics?
Yeah, this is a political issue. Old people vote. Austin, you're not wrong, right? Old people vote. It is not popular for a politician to say, folks, we got to deal with Social Security. We can't start paying you Social Security at 65 years of age, 67 years of age, 70 years of age. The money's not there. That's not a popular platform for a politician. So instead, we decided that we're not going to talk about it. Nobody in government wants to address it. And so, because we don't want to deal with it, it's like our national debt, right? Because we don't want to deal with it and because it's not popular, we'll just wait until it just implodes, okay? Well, at some point, we are going to get to, I think economists estimate it's 20 to 25 years from now, we're only going to have enough income here in the United States, like national income, like our government's income. We're only going to have enough to pay like the interest on our national debt and Social Security. That's it. Yes, the sad part is your generation will end up paying for it. You cannot, I repeat, you cannot depend on Social Security for retirement. I'm sorry, but it's the truth. Your generation has to be better savers than your parents and your grandparents ever were. You need to start saving now. If it's $10 a week, you got to start now. Because you just simply won't have any money to retire, or you'll just work until you're dead, which I don't think your generation wants to do either. You're the generation who actually doesn't want to do that. And so I would just encourage you to think about that as you're making decisions about your retirement, okay? Scary, yes, but nobody else is going to tell you the truth, right? I digress. Let's move on. We got other stuff to cover. Oh, sorry. Let's talk about how you spend your money. You see how services is that big, huge portion, 55%. The minute I laid eyes on that graph, I knew that there was something I wasn't understanding about that. Well, your author has thrown rent and mortgages into services because they are services, frankly. Renting, somebody's letting you use their house, that's a service. And even mortgages. Folks, when you buy a house, you don't own the house, right? You own the mortgage on the house for the most part, unless you've paid cash for it. And that's a service. Someone has loaned you money so that you can, over time, buy a house and live it in the meantime. So both of those are services, and that's why that's such a huge chunk. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on to firms. So we've done our first tier economic decision makers. Now we're going to roll on to the second one. These first two slides regarding firms are going to be really the important ones that you're going to want to perhaps jot down a few notes for the exam. But then the last couple are going to be sort of more random stuff that aren't nearly as important. So types of firms. Sole proprietorship is the most common type of firm in the United States. Now, the type of firm you have simply depends on the paperwork and the red tape, the bureaucratic sort of requirements that are involved in setting up that firm. It's a paperwork thing, okay? What percentage, and if you're a reader, you might have read this in the book, but if not, just give me a guess. What percentage of total firms in the US do you think are sole proprietorships, which means there is a single owner? Somebody typically just working with themselves and for themselves. 80%? Taylor, that's a really good guess. 60? Yeah, it's actually somewhere in between. Okay, yep, Dylan, it's between 70 and 75%. This is simply an issue of education or lack of therefore. Sole proprietorships are very, very easy to set up in terms of paperwork. It can be done very quickly. The problem is if you set up a sole proprietorship, you're setting yourself up. It can create huge problems in the long run. It's easy in the short run, but can create huge problems in the long run for you. And it's usually because people who are setting up a sole proprietorship really don't understand the other options that are available to them, and perhaps don't understand what they're opening themselves up to. Yeah, you have the right to all the profits that you earn. And a lot of times sole proprietorships, the type of people we find in sole proprietorships would be like a dentist or a carpenter or an electrician or a truck driver. Somebody like that is going to have a sole proprietorship. Yeah, you get all the profit, but you have unlimited liability, which means that if something goes bad with your business, you make a mistake, someone gets hurt, something like that happens, you're in big trouble. They can come after everything you own. So obviously you'd want to get a huge insurance policy, a liability insurance policy to go with this, which are very expensive. But you could actually have set up a different type of firm that probably would have protected you from some of that, okay? And we'll get to one of those. Partnership is a lot like a sole proprietorship, except for it's 2, 3, 4, 5 people who basically join together, split the profits between them, not necessarily evenly, but split the profits between them, but collectively, as a group, they still bear that same unlimited liability. So not a lot better, just distributes the profits and distributes the liability a little bit too. Again, you'd still need a huge liability insurance policy in that sort of a firm setup. Again, this is a paperwork issue, right? People don't like paperwork. The third kind of firm that we're going to talk about is a corporation. Corporations are owned by stockholders. People who have bought stock in the company actually have fractional ownership in that company. This is a pretty safe way to have ownership in a company, is to buy stock in that company. Yeah, your fraction might be a fraction of a % of ownership, which in many cases it is, or you could own 40 or 50% of a company's stock, right? Depending on the situation. But here's the thing. If the company gets sued for something, they can't come after your personal assets. And so that does protect you. Yeah, you can lose every penny that you use to buy that stock with, if the stock becomes, if stock doesn't have any value, if the company closes down or whatever. But at least your own personal assets can't be sort of dragged into that. Really the negative thing with corporations is something called double taxation, which means that the government taxes corporate income at the corporate level, and then some of that income is distributed to employees, to CEOs, bonuses, whatever, payouts, that then gets taxed again as personal income by the people it gets distributed. So the thing about earning money through a corporation is that the corporation actually does lose a lot of profit and money because of this double taxation that happens. So people that work for a company lose as well. The one type of firm, and there are more than one, that we're going to talk about that is more of a happy mix of the two is going to be what's called an S Corp. S doesn't stand for anything. It's like section S of the tax code talks about. Yeah, so the S doesn't stand for anything. Actually provides owners is, again, it's the way you set it up. It's the paperwork you do at the beginning that determines what type of a firm you end up with in the end and what your liability is and what your ability to make profits are. But provides limited liability to the owners, so protects them from their personal assets being taken if something bad should happen and there's some liability. And the profits are only taxed once. So one of the stipulations of an S Corp is that the profits that are made during the year, most of those profits, they're allowed to retain a little bit of profit in the company just to handle sort of day-to-day operations, or if they're thinking about expansion, things like that. But most of the profit actually has to be distributed to the people who are shareholders in the S Corp. So at the end of the year, they kind of need to distribute all the profits that were made. And that ensures that taxes do get paid under S Corp. S Corps don't really pay corporate income tax, but instead, all of that profit is distributed as personal income to individuals who then have to pay personal income tax. So it gets you away from that double taxation that corporations would have, would require, but has limited liability, so sort of protects you from those partnership, sole proprietorship sort of issues that you can have. So it's a nice mix of the two. Kind of running low on time, so I'm going to go through these next two fairly quickly. But they're not as important and not as common. And the first one we're going to talk about is something called a cooperative. It is a type of firm. Cooperative is a group of people who pool their resources to buy or sell more efficiently. So we have two main types of cooperatives. The first one is a consumer cooperative, people who want to buy more efficiently. And then we have producer cooperatives, which is going to be on the next slide, people who want to sell more efficiently. So these are usually smaller groups of people who kind of band together. Now, with a consumer cooperative, the best consumer cooperative, the one most of you have probably heard of, the most popular consumer cooperative out there is actually REI, which is a huge consumer cooperative, right? But in many cases, consumer cooperatives are going to be a little bit smaller, small groups of people who want to buy, let's say, like produce together. So there are a lot of produce cooperatives. So people who buy a small truckload of produce and then distribute it between themselves, something like that. But REI is a big one. It's operated and owned by its consumers in order to cut down on costs. You wouldn't know that going in there, right? The prices seem high, but maybe for what you get, right? And then we have producer cooperatives. These are a lot more common. I actually spent part of my childhood in the Midwest, and many times farmers would create cooperatives because for small farmers to rent a truck or a railroad car to get either their animals or their crops to market would be very expensive. And a lot of times they don't need a whole train car for wheat or whatever. And so what they would do instead is they would pool their money and get one train car to take, whatever, the cattle they have to market. They would also maybe buy a single piece of $1 million farm equipment jointly. So 5 farmers pool their resources to buy one tractor or something, and then they would split it between the 5 of them, something like that. And so producer cooperatives are probably more common than you think. In downtown Flag, this is going to take the form of all those artists who rent one space and each set up a table with their art. There are lots of other farmers markets, things like this, that you would see around in terms of producer cooperatives. And then the last one that we're going to talk about, these aren't all the firms available. These aren't all the types of firms. They're just the most common, and they're the ones that your author has included in the book. And the last one is going to be not-for-profit organizations, so nonprofits. The common misconception about nonprofits is that they're not trying to maximize revenue. They are trying to maximize revenue. They're trying to bring in as much money as possible. But when you think about what the actual definition of profit is, it's revenue minus expenses. So the whole idea is that they bring in lots of money, but then they spend it all on whatever that cause is, that, charitable, humanitarian, or cultural cause, that at the end of the year, when they net revenue and expenses, it zeroes out. It's a not-for-profit. But up front, they are trying to maximize revenues like every other firm. What they aren't trying to necessarily do is have all that leftover profit at the end of the year. Now, not-for-profits have run into some trouble before, right? Because the whole idea is to zero out your profit at the end of the year, or zero out your revenue at the end of the year with all your expenses. Not-for-profits have run into issues because of what their expenses are, what they do end up spending that money on that zeroes out their profit. Sometimes it ends up being salaries that are too high, bonuses that are too high, luxuries that are unnecessary for CEOs and things like that. But for the most part, their objective is hopefully, ideally, to spend money on whatever it is that their cause is, to zero that out in the end. Any questions about any of this? Everybody good?